to warmly welcome all of you here this evening. Let me start by saying that we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we are meeting, and in particular we pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. This evening, as ever with our public seminars, we have a broad cross-section of constituencies. Obviously the staff and students of the Australian National University, our own alumni of the National Security College, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the members of the Australian policy community, members of the general public. All of you are extremely welcome. These seminars are becoming increasingly popular, as this evening's attendance indicates, even on days when the ministry is reshuffled. And some people, I'm sure, are distracted late into the night this evening. We're particularly delighted to have one of our own addressing one of these public seminars this evening in Professor Michael Wesley. Michael joined the National Security College in January this year, and we were delighted that he did so. He's a Professor of National Security here at ANU, and in particular he is the Director of our Academic Outreach and Research program at the National Security College. As most, if not all of you will know, prior to that he was the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute in Sydney from 2009 to 2012, and prior to that he was Professor of International Relations and Head of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University in Queensland. He's got a very broad, deep background in both academic and policy work, in universities in Australia and in Asia and beyond, and in a policy sense in the work of the Office of National Assessment some years back. So he brings both a deep expertise from academia along with a practical experience to the analysis of these issues. He's published widely and influentially, particularly on issues to do with tonight's topic, the new geopolitics in Asia. This is the consuming strategic issue of our time, the economic transformation of Asia, its strategic consequences and its implications for Australia. So for the college this is a very critical part of our focus and work, and to have someone with Michael's expertise and well-earned reputation, it's a very great delight for me tonight to welcome him not only to the college and to the university, but to this broader strategic community of which we're all part. So Michael, thank you very much. We look forward to your comments and we look forward to the exchange afterwards. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's an absolute delight to be here tonight. It's absolute delight to be at the ANU. The ANU is a place that I've wanted to come and work at for a very long time. And the quality, not only of the colleagues, some very distinguished ones of whom are here tonight, but also the broader policy community, the diplomatic community, and so it's a great delight to be here. On a wintry London evening, the 25th of January 1904, a 43-year-old geographics professor named Halford Mackinder rose to present a paper at the Royal Geographical Society. The title of his talk was The Geographical Pivot of History. He began by proclaiming the end of what he called the Columbian epoch, meaning an end to the age of discovery and expansion into previously unknown regions of the globe. From the present time forth, he proclaimed, in the post-Columbian age, we shall have to deal with a closed political system. Every explosion of social forces, instead of being dissipated in a surrounding circuit of unknown space and barbaric chaos, will be sharply re-echoed from the far side of the globe, and weak elements in the political and economic organism of the world will be shattered in consequence, unquote. The key to understanding the post-Columbian age, argued Mackinder, lay in being able to relate the grand sweep of history, the rise and fall of empires and civilisations, to the geographic chessboard on which they played out. The key to understanding the great strategic dynamics of human history for Mackinder lay in looking at a map. In this speech and later writings, Mackinder divided the earth into the following regions. What he called the world island, comprising Asia, Europe and Africa. Some offshore islands, such as the British Isles and Japan, and the outlying islands, comprising the Americas and Australia. Of supreme importance to Mackinder was the world island. This Mackinder further divided into a heartland or pivot area, comprising modern-day Eastern Europe, Iran, Central Asia and Russia. Surrounding the heartland was an inner crescent, comprising Western Europe, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and most of China. Further out was an insular crescent, Africa, the Americas and Australia. Now, Mackinder's point was that in the control of the heartland lay the key to the control of the world. As he pithily put it in a later book, quote, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island controls the world, unquote. And Mackinder was nothing if not committed. After the end of the First World War, he left the ivory tower of academia and went to southern Russia as a consul to try and help the White Russian forces take the heartland back from the Bolsheviks. And he was knighted for his efforts. Now, unsuccessful as he was in taking the heartland back from the Bolsheviks, Mackinder's grand map has had a decisive effect on history. One of Mackinder's enthusiastic followers was the Nazi geographer Karl Haushofer, who was a major influence on Hitler's ideas of Lebensraum and Drang nach Osten. Mackinder's influence survived that association and was injected into American Cold War strategy by European immigrants such as Robert Strauss-Hupé and Nicholas Spykman, who pointed out that the Soviet bloc controlled the heartland and that was a big problem for the United States. Mackinder's influence lived on in the two most influential secretaries of state before Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who were also interestingly European immigrants. The problem was, and he's had 109 years of history for it to come right, that Mackinder's heartland theory was spectacularly wrong. The Soviet bloc's control of the heartland led not to world power, but to isolation, weakness and premature collapse. Its successor states are hardly racing up the world power rankings. But Mackinder continues to exert a powerful sway. You just have to read Robert Kaplan's recent hagiography, The Revenge of Geography. Now, arguably, it's not Mackinder's theory, but his method that is so beguiling. That is the method of geopolitics, the ability to tell grand stories of history and geography and to comfort oneself that the future thereby becomes less confusing. In an interesting return of history, showing that the ghost of Mackinder still stalks the halls, we have a US administration now speaking of a pivot of American power and influence back to Asia. This evening, I'd like to propose a new understanding of geopolitics, to look at how the combination of rapid economic growth, national ambition and fear, and the hard realities of geography are likely to shape the strategic dynamics of Asia over the coming decades. As we in Australia gaze somewhat avariciously toward the Asian century, there is a tendency to project the past in a straight line into the future. I've argued elsewhere that the economic growth in Asia we've become so used to since the end of the Vietnam War was built on three pillars. The first being a relatively flat power topography, meaning that no state in Asia was large enough, rich enough, and internally united enough to be able to contemplate a bid for regional leadership. Secondly, which left Asian states the luxury of focusing on enrichment rather than rivalry. And thirdly, which allowed the United States to overlay the region with a hegemony-light system of alliances for reassurance. The big question is, will these conditions of growth, stability, and a lack of rivalry continue? I think the answer is no, for three reasons. The first is that economic growth is not secular. Economic growth alters societies' self-perceptions, their expectations, and their beliefs. Secondly, Asia's economic growth has brought a rapid expansion in the external dependence and vulnerabilities of its societies. And third, the era of the Asia-Pacific, a neat set of reinforcing trade, investment and security dynamics around the Pacific Rim, has been superseded by a much more messy Indo-Pacific age. Here you can see the emphatic development of the Indo-Pacific trade dynamic, which underpins the rediscovery of a very old power highway, a corridor along the Earth's surface where the world's major power and wealth dynamics take place. Now, there are currently three policy approaches to Asia's messy new strategic reality. The dominant one is hope, that it'll all work out okay, that the rising powers will reconcile themselves to the existing rules of the game, that making money will trump all. Another approach is the Obama pivot. The answer is for the United States to refocus its attention on Asia and, along with its partners, re-establish American predominance in Asia. The third is what Richard Rigby amusingly calls the new White Australia policy, namely Hugh White's call for Australia to encourage the United States to cede strategic space and forge a great power concert with the United States. Sorry, to cede strategic space to China and forge a great power concert between the United States and China. Now, one or more of these may indeed be the right approach to Asia's strategic future. But I would argue that we will not know this, and we cannot know this unless we look more closely at Asia's unfolding strategic dynamics. Sensible policy must always be based on a sober assessment of underlying strategic realities. It must ask, what are the strategic dynamics? How will they develop? What are our objectives given these dynamics? And what resources and policies do we need to achieve them? I believe that a more circumscribed concept of geopolitics can help us out here. That is, a version that is shorn of the grand sweeps of history and the cartoonish political chessboards. Geopolitics, to me, is simply the interaction between geography and power. How does geography influence the accumulation and deployment of power? And how does power influence the division, control of, and relative importance of geography. Now, the first point I'd like to make is a geographic one. Australia needs to stop chopping up Asia into bits that are most important to us and forgetting about the rest. Asia, and by Asia I mean the continent of Asia, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from the Indian Ocean to the Arctic Ocean, has ceased becoming little more than a geographic expression and has started to become economically and strategically an integrated region. This and the other strategic dynamics I want to talk about is being driven, I believe, by 5 developments. The first and most basic is the rapid growth of Asia's 2 continental-sized economies. What do I mean by continental size? Well, both China and India are larger in population terms than all of the continents on Earth, or each of the continents on Earth, other than the one that they occupy. These are massive societies. The rapid growth of Asia's 2 continental-sized economies, coupled with the rapid expansion in their dependence on external markets and resources, the fact that they are rising in an extraordinarily crowded neighbourhood in which their smaller neighbours are also growing fast. Now, the consequence, or one consequence of this growth, is the pronounced geographic separation between Asia's centres of consumption and Asia's centres of production, particularly when it comes to minerals and energy. Here you can see IEA projections of the net oil import dependence of China, India and Southeast Asia. And as you can see in this next slide, there really is only one source of energy that can supply that level of demand and growth. The third aspect is the physical properties of these commodities, which means that the bulk of them must be transported along concentrated and non-redundant transport channels. Number 4, rapid economic growth and wealth creation has touched off what I believe is a rising prestige rivalry among Asia's rising powers. And number 5, all of which lead to a rising sense of strategic claustrophobia in Asia's 2 continental powers, China and India. I believe that these 5 factors are playing out on 2 dimensions across the continent of Asia. There is a terrestrial dimension across Asia's northern tier and a maritime dimension across Asia's southern tier. Now, these 2 tiers, I believe, are related, but in the interests of time, I want to concentrate for the rest of this lecture on Asia's southern tier. The growing strategic rivalry across Asia's southern tier can be read from basic arms acquisition statistics. Just last year, SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, reported that the period from 2007 to 2011 saw a volume of arms transfers into one region of Asia's southern tier, Southeast Asia, that were 200% higher than those between 2002 and 2006. This volume of arms imports into Southeast Asia was the highest since the end of the Vietnam War. Naval weapons form the bulk of these purchases, with ships and maritime weapons accounting for 52% of the total, and another 37% accounting for weapons with a possible maritime role. SIPRI reports that a similar level and profile is evident in weapons acquisition intentions in this region also. The question is, what is driving these trends? Once again, I believe there are 5 key elements. The first is an anxiety among many southern tier states about their own dependence on external resource supplies. Number two, despite, or more pertinently, perhaps because of, their own anxiety, there are signs of a growing willingness to contemplate manipulating rivals' dependence on external resource supplies. A good example of this occurred when China and Japan got into dispute some years back over some islands between them, and China cut off the supply of rare earth metals to Japanese industry. Number three, given the growing rivalries and capabilities in the region, a wariness among its states about direct confrontation and escalation of disputes. Number four, as a result of this reluctance, a growing awareness of the options for what has been called horizontal escalation, that is, responding to confrontation in one location by threatening to exploit a rival's vulnerabilities in another location. And number five, the growing coincidence of new territorial demands by rising powers with the rising importance of strategic sea lanes. Let me just explain what I mean by all of this. Let me give you a couple of possible examples. One example might be a United States that is unwilling to risk a direct naval confrontation with China in the Taiwan Strait could threaten to shut down the Strait of Hormuz to China-bound oil tankers. Another example might be China, in order to build pressure on Japan over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, could start harassing Japanese ships in the South China Sea. Another example, India, under pressure from China on their mutual land border, could threaten to squeeze off access through the Andaman Sea for Chinese ships. These and a range of other permutations are made possible through the interaction of power and geography in Asia. Taken together, the factors of India's and China's strategic claustrophobia, the growing external resource dependence of Asia's rising powers, and the attractive strategic possibilities of horizontal escalation highlight what I think are three key geographical elements of Asia's southern tier geography that will I believe, become the likely focus for strategic competition in the future. I like to think of them as three peninsulas and three bays. The three peninsulas are the South Asian Peninsula, the Indo-Pacific Peninsula, and the West Pacific Peninsula. Now, I think that peninsular geography interacts with power in peculiar ways. It constrains, concentrates, funnels, and strategically bundles power. Strategic shifts in one part of a peninsula are likely to cascade through to its other parts. Peninsulas tend to be strategically stable if they are dominated by a single set of strategic interests. But once a contrary strategic interest gains hold in any part of a peninsula, they can become extremely unstable. Two of the Indo-Pacific peninsulas, the South Asian and West Pacific peninsulas, hold the key to India's and China's strategic claustrophobia. Each of these is held in full or part by rivals of these two powers. Each contains parts of India's and China's historic sense of wholeness. Each are sites of strategic footholds by major rivals. For China to gain control of the West Pacific Peninsula, or for India to become supreme on the South Asian Peninsula, would represent major advances in their regional and global power capabilities. The Indo-Pacific Peninsula, the one in the middle, is just as crucial. As the land divide between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, it is a vital frontier between American power and Indian and Chinese ambitions. Any one power or combination of powers that gained supremacy over the Indo-Pacific Peninsula would hold the key to the broader Indo-Pacific region. Interestingly, each of these three peninsulas is partially comprised of a major second-tier power, going from west to east: Pakistan in South Asia, Indonesia in the Indo-Pacific Peninsula, and Japan in the West Pacific Peninsula, whose choices will be crucial to the fate of its respective peninsula. Moving on to the bays. The three bays are the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the South China Sea. I believe the geography of bays interacts with power in particular ways too. Bays are enclosed bodies of water that engage the territorial imagination in particular ways. One can imagine owning a bay, in strategic terms, much more easily than one can imagine owning a broader sea or an ocean. Secondly, these bays are historical trade hubs with abundant historical, cultural and therefore contemporary civilisational overlays. I've taken this map from a wonderful book by Janet Abu-Lughod in which she describes three trading circuits in the broader Indo-Pacific region that existed before the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1490s. Circuit 1, each of these was driven by particular monsoon winds. Circuit 1 was very much the province of Arab traders. Circuit 2, the province of Indian traders. And Circuit 3, the province of Southeast Asian and Chinese traders. The interesting thing about these circuits was that they made certain ports that you can see that she's pointed out, crucial points of meeting and exchange for those circuits. The important thing about these historical points, and let's not forget they're over 600 years ago, is that they've given particular territorial claims, those of India in the Bay of Bengal, those of China in the South China Sea, a cultural civilisational overlay that we would be silly to overlook. Now, each of these bays are subject to territorial disputes and expansive great power sovereignty claims. Each is bordered by one big and several smaller claimants, with the United States as the anxious guarantor of the maritime commons in the background. Each bay is attended by complex politics and strategy around its ingress and egress points. And as you can see, each of these bays has choke points that control access to it. And there are big strategic questions being asked by rising powers in this part of the world. Does the control of a bay confer or negate control of a choke point? Conversely, does control of a choke point confer or negate control of a bay? Does Chinese control of the South China Sea, for example, give it control over the Malacca Straits? Or does the ability of the United States, perhaps, to control the Malacca Straits negate possible Chinese control of the South China Seas? Three peninsulas, three bays. If I was to try and find a Macanderian formula, I'm not quite sure of the adjective that comes with his names, it would be something like this. The peninsulas hold the key to the bays hold the key to the peninsulas. So, for example, as we start to look at the region as three peninsulas and three bays, the further expansion of Chinese influence down the Indo-Pacific Peninsula could further split ASEAN solidarity, which we saw so spectacularly split at the ASEAN summit meetings last year, allowing it to continue to advance its claims to the South China Sea. Creeping Chinese control over the South China Sea would in turn bring it much closer to its goals of gaining control, or at least neutralising others' control over the first island chain, the West Pacific Peninsula, including by ramping up the pressure on territorial disputes with Japan in the East China Sea. To take another scenario, if India is able at some stage in the future to draw Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka into its own growth dynamic and thereby neutralise them as strategic concerns, it would enormously help its attempts to build influence in the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. India's growing presence in turn in the Bay of Bengal and into the Malacca Straits would then be able to act as a counter to Chinese control over the Indo-Pacific Peninsula and even into the South China Sea. On the other hand, China's ability to establish a permanent presence in the Arabian Sea, perhaps, as many discuss at the Pakistani port of Gwadar here, which potentially it could link into Western China, if ever it was brave enough to build and man the infrastructure, will decisively counter India's position in the South Asian Peninsula and the Arabian Sea itself. Now, arguably, ladies and gentlemen, this geopolitical perspective on Asia's future raises more questions than it answers. Many of these developments are nascent. Big unknowns abound. There are some very big questions here. To what extent, for example, will the United States be able to maintain maritime supremacy against the naval build-ups of so many southern tier states? Will United States supremacy be able to maintain supremacy as the rivalry hots up between southern tier Asian states? What are China's and India's abilities to build lasting geopolitical influence on their peninsulas while establishing lasting supremacy over their respective bays? To what extent will peninsula and littoral states forge a strategic common purpose or be divided and dominated by their great power neighbours? All of these are major questions. For Australia, I believe there are big questions, but I think there are also some key and clear implications. First and foremost, we must get used to the fact that we are not separate from all of this, that we are not separate from a geographic entity called Southeast Asia. In fact, we should ban and we should banish the term Southeast Asia from our lexicon. We should, in this country, get used to the fact that we are an integral part of the Indo-Pacific Peninsula and that we cannot escape the escalating great power competition for that peninsula. Second, we must stop thinking tactically and start thinking strategically about this region. Instead of constantly prioritising relationships with certain countries as the foundation of our foreign and defence policies, we need to start thinking in terms of 3 bays and 3 peninsulas and their unfolding strategic dynamics. The outcome in each of these bays and peninsulas will have profound implications for our future safety and our future wealth. And we need to think hard about all of the possible strategic permutations in the 3 bays and 3 peninsulas. Third, in terms of policy directions, I believe that neither multilateralism nor bilateralism will provide a way forward. The great powers will, and arguably already are, using the region's institutions as instruments of their rivalry, and this will continue. Staking our future on Asia's regional institutions being able to mitigate this scale of rivalry will be, I think, a profound mistake. But neither will cultivating good bilateral relations with the major powers in Asia, as the Asian Century White Paper suggests, be enough. A small player like Australia, I believe, risks being either ignored or played off by the major powers in this region. Instead, I believe we need to find a flexible, plurilateral approach to the region, in which we place an equal or even greater emphasis on building common cause and understanding with countries closer to our own size. Be it in the bays or the peninsulas, it is the choices of medium-sized and small states that will hold the key, I think, to our strategic future. These are our natural caucus group, and we should be pouring resources into a deepening, continuing engagement with them over the fates and dynamics of the peninsulas and bays. In particular, we need to build our strategic relations with the peninsula swing states, particularly Japan and Indonesia, helping shape and bolster their strategic visions for the peninsulas they occupy and the bays that they abut. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing is for certain. The Asian century will almost certainly not be benign for Australia if we continue to be strategically naive about how rapid economic growth affects security dynamics in our region. But by thinking geopolitically about Asia as a whole, its northern and its southern tiers, its bays and its peninsulas, we can survive and prosper in the Asian century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and I'll just say a few words in wrapping up later on about that presentation. But we've got now about 20-25 minutes where we can take contributions from the floor in terms of perspectives and questions. With the large numbers we have, can I just ask that the focus be precise, as I'm sure the answers will be, and we'll be able to get through as many people as we can and get you out the door and back to dinner on time. So the floor is open if any perspectives wish to be had up the top. Maybe if you could just also introduce yourself and if you're from a particular organisation.
Hi, thanks. Paula Claudianis from AusAid. I'm just wondering, my question is pretty basic. Why stop there? If you're saying we need to, if I understood what you're saying well, it's that we shouldn't be thinking so in terms of close, like just this one bay and this one peninsula, we need to expand and see how it's all interrelated. So why would you stop at that third bay? Why wouldn't you see how that third bay is related onto that next part of Eastern Europe, and then from there you'd be going on and saying, well, we're all so interrelated, we need to see how everything is working against each other.
Sure. Look, thanks very much for that question. I think the answer lies sort of in these two slides. Just the raw trade figures show that it's that Indo-Pacific coastline that stretches from the Persian/Arabian Gulf around to Japan and Korea, around the southern coast of Asia, which is where the real growth in world trade lies. And I guess it's this one as well. The fact that we have such a massive rise in external oil dependence, energy dependence. And if you put that together with oil flows, one of the basic things that's occurred over the past 20 to 30 years is a regionalisation of oil flows. So basically what that means is that these countries, you could also add a country like Korea into this, you could also add Taiwan into this. They have become predominantly dependent on supplies from the Gulf. So basically, my argument is that this is where, you know, if you like, the cockpit of vulnerability, mutual dependence, and therefore strategic rivalry will occur. And when you put that together with the particular geography of the region, and in particular its choke points, its maritime routes, the position of the great powers in proximity to these bays, I think you've got a particularly complex geopolitical situation. You mentioned about Eastern Europe, and I have been asked before about what separates Europe from all of this. I think a couple of things separate Europe from all of this. The first one is a couple of what I call geopolitically ambiguous states. One is Turkey and one is Russia. Both of these states at this stage can't quite make up their minds whether they belong to Europe or belong to Asia, and therefore they're not particularly geopolitically committed to either. The other element you can't really sketch on a map, and that is an element of mindset. In my former job, we welcomed a delegation of French parliamentarians who were here on a fact-finding tour, and we had a round table with them talking about what's happening in the world. And at the end of it, the senior member of the delegation, a member of the French Senate, said to us, you know, the big difference between Europe and this part of the world is that in this part of the world, all you can think about is the rise of China, whereas in Europe, all we can think about is the rise of Islam. And so you get the feeling that, with some honourable exceptions, Europeans aren't really focused on this sort of power rivalry. They're much more internally focused, they're much more concerned with their own economics, whether Europe will survive, and then the instability in the Middle East. I think in this part of the world, we've got a very different set of strategic concerns which really arise from where we are and how close all of this is starting to occur to us. To give you a very practical example, the South China Sea, the bay I was talking about, 54% of Australian trade sails through that particular stretch of water. It's something that really does concentrate the mind.
Right, let's go. We'll go to Frank up the middle there, and then we'll keep moving around as quickly as we can.
Thanks very much. Frank Ross, Visiting Fellow of International Relations, ANU, and thank you for your... Oh.
Okay, I've got that, Frank.
Yes, thanks for your wonderful lecture. I wonder if I can just ask you something about the latter part of your lecture, where you said in relation to Australian policy that neither a, if I understand correctly, neither a bilateral nor a multilateral approach would in themselves be necessary, would be appropriate and adequate for an Australian approach. And you said, I think, that a plurilateral approach would be desirable from Australia's point of view, say in relation to the Indo-Pacific Bay and Peninsula and zone. How would you like to make some more comments about how you and we might distinguish a plurilateral approach from a multilateral? And are there some elements in the existing, admittedly vulnerable and fragile multilateral dialogues and institutions that can be drawn on to help build up the plurilateral approach that you have identified as desirable?
Yeah, look, thanks, Frank. I mention those two alternatives because they tend to be the partisan alternatives that we get in Australian politics. We tend to have a Labor Party that's very taken with multilateral institutions as the primary vehicle of foreign policy, and a coalition that is very taken with bilateralism, practical bilateralism. And I think the problem, if I can deal with bilateralism first, is that it suffers from a lack of strategic synthesising ability. In dealing with the realities of bilateral relations, you can lose sight of the bigger strategic dynamics of what's going on. Asia's institutions, its multilateral institutions, I think, share weaknesses with all multilateral institutions, and that is, once they get set up, they become quite rigid structures. They become bound by rules. They become bound by membership, they become bound by levels of power and say within them. Of course, one of the big problems with Asia's multilateral institutions is that they have a unanimity rule, which means that if any of the members of the organisation objects to a question being discussed by the institution, it can't be discussed. And therefore, some of the biggest security challenges in the region, some of the biggest disputes in the regions simply can't be discussed and resolved potentially by Asia's institutions. By a plurilateral approach, I mean a flexible approach, a non-institutionalised approach, an approach that has a nominal membership but no rules, an approach that builds discussions on particular questions not because of a fixed membership but because of those who are interested in being subject to a discussion. An example of a plurilateral discussion might be the Bali process that Indonesia and Australia collaborated on in developing, trying to develop a common approach to asylum seekers, to counter-terrorism and to organised crime in the region. I think it has the advantages of both approaches. From the bilateral approach, it takes a very pragmatic approach, it takes a very non-structured approach. It looks at building agreement from the ground up. From the multilateral approach, it takes the ability to bring together groups of countries, the groups of countries that are interested, but it doesn't bring with it the weaknesses of either approach. And I do think in the South China Sea, Australia can be much more active in the background. I know that Australia is not a direct participant in any of those disputes, and that's a good thing. I think, as you wrote yourself, Frank, in terms of Australia's early work on finding a resolution to the Cambodia conflict in the 1980s, Australia can be creative in a plurilateral way in trying to work behind the scenes to bring about solutions to particular conflicts or sites of tension in the region. And I think we should be much more ambitious than we have been in relation to some of these territorial disputes.
I'll just move along the blocks to be fair. Over here, did I see some hands in the front, please?
Hi, Andrew Carr from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Thank you very much for your talk tonight, Michael. A lot of the kind of internal logic of your talk seemed based on shipping and especially oil shipping and the importance of that. So I was wondering if you could give us your views on the rise of new energy sources, in particular, not just the renewables, which are hyped, but especially shale, gas and other technologies, and perhaps even 3D printing and other things, which threaten to challenge the importance of these shipping lanes and this supply.
Sure. I guess it's only partly based on energy. I think we're going through an energy phase at the moment, and that's what makes the countries in this particular part of the world so worried. You cut off China's energy supply, and it's in real trouble. You cut off Korea's energy supply, it's in real trouble. But I think it will evolve. One of the things that I haven't included in tonight's presentation is the trade in manufactures, particularly distributed manufacturing through the region. At this stage, it tends to be an East Asian thing, a Northeast and Southeast Asian thing, which is seeing the economies of this part of the world knitted together in much more intense distributed manufacturing arrangements where, you know, you get a Fukushima disaster in Japan and it leads to 10% falls in manufacturing across Southeast Asia. That sort of development, I think, will continue, and if the trends that we're starting to observe continue, we will see South Asia begin to be involved in those distributed manufacturing chains. Once again, depending on what the manufacturing is, if it's cars and car components, yes. If it's electronics, less so. Those are heavy, bulky commodities that need to be shipped through the the choke points and across the trade routes. So I think eventually different sources of energy may have the ability to alter some of these arrangements, but we're yet to see them. We've had bursts of enthusiasm about alternative energy sources before, and yet the world continues to be strongly dependent on oil. There is another, when I give lectures on energy security, there's another chart that I show that shows world primary energy use today and IEA projections of world primary energy use in 2030. And the interesting thing is the segments are almost not changed at all. And the big change is the massive growth in oil demand in these big Asian economies, China and India. And the fact is that only one region has economically recoverable resources able to meet those levels of demand, and that is West Asia and to a lesser extent Central Asia. So in answer to your question, it may have a slight effect, but I don't think it will have that game-changing effect that some people speculate over.
Anyone here would like to raise an issue in front, Christine?
Thank you very much. My name is Andy Liu from Taipei Economic Culture Office representing Taiwan government. I have a question about the trend of TPP, RCEP, all the kind of economic cooperation and free trade agreement have been going on for many years. And Australia has been a very active, one of the most active country. So beside from ASEAN +1, +3, +6, now you have TPP going on, you have RCEP going on. Had it been one of your major concerns for Australia's strategic policy or Australia's national security policy? Because as you mentioned, Australia has been very, very much focused and emphasized on the South China Sea trading route. And beside from that kind of question, you mentioned in the book of Australia and China at 40, the conclusion article you mentioned about how Australians feel good about themselves for the last 20 years. Now Australia might need to reviewing or having a kind of rewarming of the kind of feeling. So how does this factor affect your analysis in the strategic analysis?
Oh, that's a tough question. Let me deal with the first part first. Look, I think trade and investment integration in this part of the world will advance. I think it will be assisted by government policy, such as the agreements you were talking about. I think that they have a reasonably bright future. But whereas 20 years ago, the vogue was to say that advancing trade and investment integration will mitigate strategic rivalry in this and other parts of the world, I think the evidence is fairly clear that trade and investment integration, which has continued at a massive pace in this part of the world over the past 20 years, has done nothing to mitigate strategic rivalry. In fact, we've seen the two dynamics almost completely disassociated. And we've got the situation where Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Australia, Thailand, name a country in this part of the world, has China as its major trading partner and the United States as its major security partner. You're seeing this sort of bifurcation in interests developing, and it means that the region is becoming much more complex. So I guess my answer would be yes, I think that trade investment integration underpinned by government policy and trade agreements will continue, but I don't expect it to have very much effect at mitigating the underlying strategic rivalry. Where it may have an effect, and Hugh White and I have debated this at some length, is whether it will mitigate the possibility that conflict and sustained conflict will break out. Hugh, I think quite reasonably believes that the possibility of conflict breaking out is present. I tend to think he's right, but where I think it will have an effect is on the willingness of the participants in conflict, let's say a dispute, a conflict, an exchange of fire in, say, the South China Sea. Where it will have an effect is on the willingness of the disputants to escalate. And I think in those cases, they will probably try and avoid vertical escalation, which is to use bigger and more powerful weapons against each other in that location, in favour of some form of horizontal escalation to try and force the other side to back down. In terms of the mindset issue that I described in my chapter in that collection, I haven't really had to think about it. I was mainly thinking domestically. But I do think that Australia has over time become less ambitious in foreign policy terms. I think there was a period in Australia's foreign policy making where we really were ambitious in what we were trying to do. You might say that we were irritatingly ambitious. In the words of Alexander Downer, he said we had an irrepressible activism that arguably at times does irritate countries in the region. I think we've lost some of that in recent years, and I'd like to see us start to become a bit more ambitious in the future.
In the middle. Thank you.
Professor Wesley, thanks for your talk. I'm Rachel Major from DIAC and also a student at the GSSD. I just wanted to ask you to elaborate further on a comment you made. You mentioned that one means to secure the interests of Australia is actually to bolster Indonesia's strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific Peninsula. Would you care to comment further on that?
Yeah, look, I think that's what I mean when a lot of diplomats, former and current, get irritated when I advocate greater activism, and they sort of say, well, what else can we do? I think what else we can do is, and this will take time, is begin an ongoing and intense conversation with between strategic policy makers in Australia and Indonesia and Japan and other countries in the region, and to make it not only let's get together for a day every year, as we currently have, but let's get together repeatedly. Let's keep those conversations going. Let's do it electronically, and let's build, on a really intensive basis, a common way of looking at the world. Interestingly, when I was at ONA, the country in our part of the world that was most willing to do this with us was Singapore. And we found not only at ONA but across government the willingness of the Singaporeans to come to Australia and us to welcome us to Singapore to talk these issues through was really endless, almost endless. I'm not sure whether that level of consultation continues, but I remember taking part in some of these, and obviously the Singaporeans and we Australians have some differences in how we see the region, how we see the rise of China, the rise of India and the different strategic dynamics, but the fact that we were having those conversations was enormously important. It was enormously important for us within the Canberra kind of beltway for thinking about and being able to bring different perspectives in on things, and I think hopefully it was useful for the Singaporeans as well, otherwise they wouldn't have kept on doing it. I would like to see that sort of intense, repeated engagement start to expand. I'd like to see it with, as I've said, Indonesia and Japan. I'd like to see it with Korea. I'd like to see it with, with China, India certainly, with other countries in Southeast Asia, with other countries in West Asia as well. That's the sort of engagement we have to have. It's not a transactional level of engagement. It's not a question of keeping bilateral relations on track. I think we're extremely good at doing that. It's an intellectual engagement that I think we need, and I think once again it needs particular effort, needs particular focus on both on our part, but also the parts of these prospective partners as well.
Over this side, in the middle, thanks. Up the top.
Michael, Ralph Daltario, Attorney General's Department. Look, in terms of that deeper engagement, do you see any role at all for the multilateral or architecture that we have in the region to actually help to build that kind of in-depth dialogue? You know, combining government, academia, business, and so on. Because as the region interacts economically more and more, do you see that it might provide a catalyst for that multilateral architecture to actually evolve to meet the needs of the region more thoroughly?
Only with a decisive departure from the norm that you can only discuss things if people aren't offended. And to an extent, Southeast Asia has been able to do that in the past through its network of think tanks, the ASEAN ISIS network, where scholars are able to get together and talk in much less constrained ways about strategic questions, and to channel their concerns and their perspectives through to the governmental level. So there is that possibility. I think it's entirely a possibility, but it does need to come without all of the trappings of a multilateral meeting, which means that people come with prepared statements. The host usually has a pre-prepared outcome that it wants to be able to announce at the end, and it becomes extraordinarily choreographed in that sense. So if some of that architecture can be used without of the constraining overlay that multilateral institutions bring with them, and you know, it's not only Asian institutions, it's other institutions as well, then yes, quite possibly, but that would have to be the absolute condition that they were used and they became useful.
Just to maintain our reputation for time limits, can we have a final rapid 3 questions, 30-second questions, 90-second answers, and then so we'll start on what's my left wing here, if there's any quick questions, or we'll go to 2 in the centre, one there. Christine, do you want to check? Just put your hand up again.
My name is Lula Navarro and I work at the Department for Defence, of Defence. You mentioned the growth in capability into the region no longer called Southeast Asia, and also mentioned at the same time...
It's catching on already.
Also mentioned at the same time, suggested perhaps that we turn away from our reliance, our security reliance on the United States. But given part of that reliance on the United States is an understood capability edge in our region, one, are you suggesting that a capability edge isn't necessary anymore in this unfolding era? Or 2, how do you suggest we maintain a capability edge at the same time as perhaps moving away from reliance on the US?
Okay. I guess I'm not advocating...
More than 90 seconds.
I guess I'm not advocating anything at the moment so much as questioning. And the question is it possible for the United States and its allies to maintain that capability edge? Is it possible, given, on the one hand, budget pressures in the United States, and on the other hand, budget pressures in allies? There's an issue here that I think needs further airing, and that is that the United States is increasingly talking about its allies and partners in the region. Its allies being Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, sometimes the Philippines. Its partners being countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, India. And the problem here is that the countries that are most likely to sign on to a US pledge to maintain a capability edge are its allies. But they are countries like Japan and Korea with serious demographic ageing issues, and a country like Australia without strategic heft to make a difference. The countries with the strategic heft to make a difference, either because of where they exist, like Vietnam, or because of their size, like India and Indonesia, are also countries with long histories of non-alignment. And they are least likely to sign on to maintaining a US strategic edge, capability edge. So there's a catch-22 here for the United States. And my question is, and I haven't really had a chance to do some thinking around this, is it possible? Is it possible? So whether or not Australia clings to the US alliance, I think should be predicated on some pretty hard-headed thinking about what the US alliance will mean in a world of 3 bays and 3 peninsulas, in a world where, you know, some of these countries are putting a lot of money, not into trying to go head-to-head with the United States, but certainly being able to contest US supremacy over the maritime commons. And that's a question I think is really important for Australia to do some thinking on.
Do we have one final one from the right-hand side?
Thanks again, Michael, for a fascinating discussion. I have not being a strategic policy wonk myself, I have a naive question, which is there a cumulative effect? Since there is a single origin for these flows, is there a cumulative effect considering whether you're in one bay or the next one or the third one? Do things get worse as you move east? And does that change strategic policy for those in those particular regions?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to have to think about that one, Manuel. Again, I've just presented the bones of half a book project, so I haven't had a chance to do further work in these. But certainly, I think US power becomes less contested as you move west, less obviously contested as you move west. It's most contested in the South China Sea, less so in the Bay of Bengal, less so in the Arabian Sea, which is an interesting position for the United States to be in. Whether China can mount real power projection into the Bay of Bengal, into the Arabian Sea is a good question. Whether India has the ability to project power into the South China Sea is another question, I think. And overlaying all of this is the dynamics of how the territorial disputes work. The other player in all of this is Iran, and Iran's ability to project power into the Gulf and into the Arabian Sea. And again, how much that contests US supremacy in that part of the world. All questions yet to be researched, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much, Michael. The aim of the National Security College's public seminar series is to provide presentations that are informed, that are considered, and that are constructively provocative. I think this evening we had all 3 of those qualities writ large. This was certainly a highly informed presentation which drew together elements of historical realities and contemporary circumstances. And as Michael started with Mackinder and spoke of his legacy, I kept thinking of Mark Twain's line about history not repeating itself, but it can rhyme. And it's really the rhyming patterns that I think the most insightful strategic analysis draws out. But it was also very cognizant of the contemporary circumstances in which many of the current debates are focused. So it was certainly considered. It was certainly very informed. It was also considered, I think, in the sense that it addressed a familiar story in some ways with perspectives that were unfamiliar. And those perspectives were based on insight and expertise and linkage. And I think that's what made it both innovative and interesting. And finally, certainly from my point of view, it was constructively provocative in the ways that Michael spoke about, drawing on traditional bilateral and multilateral emphases to develop plurilateral thinking, and in terms of the questions that he posed. And it's always refreshing to hear people in Michael's position saying that they need to think more about properly answering something than trying to answer it and kid people that they actually know what they're talking about. So I think for all of these reasons, tonight fulfilled our hopes for this series in a very, very important way, and it really reinforces for me why the ANU and now the National Security College is fortunate to have Michael here. I think he set out his own research agenda for the next 3 years tonight, so we shall look forward to regular top-ups on some of the answers to those questions that didn't have the definitive response tonight. So thank you very much, Michael, and I'll just ask you to join me again.